Over the past 9 months, we have witnessed the less meteoric downfall, but what looks more like a slow, steady decay of the reputation of one Tim Kennedy. And this episode isn't to talk about what happened. It isn't to talk about his claims. That work has already been done for us by the Antihero Podcast, but it's more or less to provide some context on how this might have happened. While the Antihero Podcast has gone through great lengths to investigate, in a journalistic sense, the claims made by Tim Kennedy, both in his book and otherwise, and try to bring some relevance to truth, this episode is meant to more or less deliver how something like this could have happened, especially in such a small community. So I'm going to present a theory on how it might have taken place, but then we're going to have to follow with the consequences of what this falling out is looking like, whether it comes to vet bashing or what is being referred to as vet bashing, and how two things can be true at the same time. Finally, we'll move on to the intent, which for many might seem like accountability, and a possible address to a road to redemption. And so while this podcast does tend to, I do try to stay away from a decent amount of the drama, having a number of guests on the show does inevitably raise the question of intercommunication on what on earth actually happened. How did this, if it is true, if and we have reason to perhaps side with Brett and the folks over at the Antihero Podcast, if what they're saying is true and that the claims made in the book are turned out to be falsehoods, then like what is the consequence of it? Not only for someone like Tim Kennedy himself, or for the greater gun culture as a whole. This is a topic that is mostly grounded within the context of our American gun culture, but it does have ramifications outward. And so if you are interested in sticking along, then, well, I hope that I am able to bring some edification to the conversation. That being said, even though this is a controversial subject, this episode is sponsored by Obsidian Arms, and they have been a friend of the channel for more than a year now, supporting us in our growth and our expanse, whether it's through our public land cleanups or just keeping this show running. And if you are interested in self-sufficiency, if you are looking at becoming a gunsmith, then I highly recommend their tools because they come with a lifetime warranty. Damage one with use, send it back, they'll replace it. Or if you are looking to build custom equipment, or if you have some design that you are looking to bring to life that requires precision machining, they are a shop out of Minnesota that provides more than just a single service to our community. And if you want to support us, there's going to be a link down below. We don't receive any money from it, but it does tell Obsidian that you are thankful for their support of the show. That being the case, if you want to get to them, go to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Now, as I began earlier, a lot of the legwork of what claims have been made and been made public has already been done by the Antihero Podcast. They've gone into a great level of investigative journalism, or they've engaged with a great level of investigative journalism to address Tim Kennedy's claims, primarily those in his book. And they've gone so far as to contact old teammates, both in the military and before, as well as people who have firsthand knowledge or were there during the events that he has told stories about. And the unfortunate reality is that many of the claims made in the book are being negated, are being not negated, but are being challenged by others who were there. And it's not just one person versus one. You have an issue where there's 2 or 3 or 4 people who, all being there, being contacted separately, have given vastly different narratives to what claims were made. And this falls within the realm of stolen valor, whether it's claiming to have certain awards that one doesn't, or whether it's claiming to have done things that would have been otherwise heroic but turns out to be falsehoods, or in other cases what has been presented as claiming to be the first person there when and doing something when really somebody else had done it. And it unfortunately created a pattern that if you've listened to Antihero Podcast presentations, seems to be consistent. Tim Kennedy claims to have been somewhere, claims to have done something, and then claims to have challenged the leadership and their integrity or something like that in some sort of act of noble address, and then only to find himself, quote, or not quote unquote, but seemingly punished for doing so. He gets to paint himself as the individual hero, the challenge to authority, and the victim of said authority. And this is my summary, which is less valuable than, say, the context that the group over, or the team over at the Antihero Podcast has done, because this is, again, not necessarily to address all of or what Tim Kennedy has claimed, but which it seems in all likelihood that his claims are not true, how someone could get away with it so long at such a grand scale. So to finally add something, or to finally address something that the Antihero Podcast has done very well, and this is coming from myself, who does, being a veteran, I appreciate their ability to illustrate the context of what is going on and what would have or could have gone on in said scenario. And that is so that they can communicate to the greater world, which is part of the concern that we're going to come into. So let me start with a theory. Let me move into a theory of how this could have happened. From the standpoint of many of us within the gun culture, especially those who are in the military veteran arena, there's a certain head-scratching confusion as to how something like this could have gone on for so long. And particularly that's because in the special operations community, you're dealing with a very small amount of people. For lack of better words, it's most likely that every other person that you know, you're at maximum one or two people disconnected from them. It's not impossible or even very difficult to call up people who are connected to your career or connected to your actions and get a second or third account of what went on. This is why stolen valor stories, especially the larger ones, come across as so bombastic, because it's not uncommon for people to get away with, say, lying about their military career in a smaller context where they never reached the fame and the scale of someone like Tim Kennedy. But now we have someone who is such a high-profile person who is under plenty of attack for making all of these claims about his supposed heroism and maybe otherwise, and yet quote unquote getting away with it for so long. And the first point to begin is that very few, if in fact I doubt very many, if any, colleagues read Tim Kennedy's book. It seems like whether it was accomplished through intentional means, that his book was only published to audiences or directed towards audiences who wouldn't have the context to make evaluations of it, or there's just the unfortunate side effect of his fame, his notoriety now, that has led people to not really want to read it. His personality in public is very grating. It does come across as a bit self-aggrandizing, and that's putting it lightly. But it's not a surprise that so few people from the special operations community or the veteran community actually went so far as to read his book. And that's because and that's allowed it to fester within storytelling for a couple of years now. But there's also a difference about in-group versus out-group perception. And this goes into if some of the claim, or if the address by the Antihero Podcast is true, and I'm couching that specifically on purpose in this way, because I believe that they are, but I'm keeping not necessarily a level of disconnection, but it's an understanding that they've done the work and I have to trust them, and I do believe it's true. But what they've developed is a pattern where Tim Kennedy, according to his book, when read in light of these issues, has essentially moved on to new audiences as quickly as the controversy would eventually come to overtake him. This began well before he was in the military, and he faced many challenges. And then there are even quotes, and there are statements by characters like Shrek McPhee who describe him as one of the most arrogant people that he's met, even though he wanted to help him keep his job. And this kind of creates an example of how it might have happened. See, if you move around enough, as you see within political circles for sure, And that does raise a red flag again, for sure, that if you can essentially stay ahead of the controversy, ride the lightning, ride that lightning ahead of your campaign, if you can get before Joe Rogan or get into the public light before all of the in-group controversy catches up to you, then you can constantly chase a new audience. And there's an argument of when that audience might run out. And I think what we're looking at is that it is starting to run out. There are very few people with it who have meaningful knowledge of this environment who would look at Tim Kennedy anymore as a role model or as a hero or as a character to look up to. But there's also another problem here, and that is that those who are currently active within the career field, whether it's Special Operations, Ranger Battalion, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, whatever, there is a certain operations tempo that goes with those jobs. People who are in that in-group, that tends to keep their attention focused on what they have to do and their own problems, whether it's within their own lives, building their own families, trying to figure out their own jobs, build their own careers, and so on and so forth, where they are very unlikely to take the time to investigate the claims of Tim Kennedy. In fact, it just probably becomes, locker room talk about, oh no, have you heard what such and such did this time? With no real apparatus or no real intent to, in this sense, bring accountability, because it comes at the cost of maybe their performance at their job. When you are in such a high intensity environment, and I know this may sound a bit like an excuse, but when you're in that high intensity environment, the amount of energy and effort that was displayed by the Antihero podcast is not available to somebody who is, say, working towards their squad leader position or their platoon sergeant position, or say their upgrades in their arena one way or another. In that context, in that framework, it makes sense why he would go, virtually unnoticed, because he's not as much going and talking to his peer group in any way, shape, or form. In fact, he's specifically selecting audiences who won't have access to the context in order to evaluate his statements. And so the final part then is that the final thing that I think that contributes to this theory of how this would have happened for so long and how we have gotten away with it for so long is that in order to do this investigation, a decent amount of resources had to be invested, and not everyone has access to it. Not everyone knows the tools, or maybe has the network to dig into exactly what happened. Imagine a guy who's been out of the military for 20 years trying to now do a deep dive investigation on Tim Kennedy without having access to that network of people who are directly attached to him. He might have had some connections, but not really as many. And then there's, other things in life that people are focused on. And this comes down to, it is a consequence on the one hand of the hero worship of the Special Operations veteran, but it's also a consequence of you could chalk it up to culture, and I really don't think that theory is either satisfying emotionally or reasonably. I think that gets a little too ambiguous, and rather what you're looking at is a series of events that caught other people and derailed them much sooner, but someone eventually slipped through the cracks, and though that is because of a multiplicity of factors, beginning with his audience selection was never within his own community. His own community was usually not focused on his claims or looked at him as some sort of, maybe not lesser than, but troublemaker. There was a lot of intent to distance people from it. There's also a political aspect to it, or maybe a diplomatic aspect to it, of not shaking the boat for the sake of shaking the boat. In fact, I think there's a direct refutation to this idea of vet bashing, which is the next piece. Now, vet bashing itself is a very vague term. Yes, I know I pronounce the word vague strangely, but bear with me. And it can oftentimes refer to infighting within the veteran community, or the overt attempt from people outside that community to attack those inside. It can create an out-group versus in-group preference problem, maybe an honor culture versus dignity culture problem. But vet bashing can also look like clout chasing, where if I can tear down somebody else's image, then that must mean that mine is of a certain scale. If I'm strong enough or big enough or bold enough to talk about somebody else, then maybe I'm the real deal. And that might be the most not dishonest, but dissatisfying element of presenting it. Now, vet bashing could also come across as a couple different things. And one of the concerns, though, about this idea of, say, when somebody with a profile as large as Tim Kennedy being found to have committed something like stolen valor in this case, then there's a concern that a conflagration would take place, that there would be it would develop fault lines within the gun culture, and that it would create not so much just a witch hunt, but a conflagration of disdain then for the veteran. You could say the disdain for anyone who has some achievement, or they suffer the losses, or then it turns into something that is not fueled by a desire for accountability, but what is oftentimes masquerading as accountability, and what that is resentment. But I think the example of not necessarily vet bashing, but the concern about, say, people addressing their grievances with Tim Kennedy or other veterans being accused of as vet bashing, is that we're looking at a reaction to years of hero worship, and it's no less or more. It's not really meant to be an accusation writ large, but how there is a concern and a voice about how, like, the veteran special operator has been put on a pedestal for many, many years. And the intriguing thing about that is that I think a very few amount of people, a very, very small selection of people, have had a great benefit from this sort of hero worship that might come from, say, the boomer generation or the early GWAT era, that we made movies about them, and we built, stories and wrote books and so on and so forth. But the problem that I would want to illustrate on that one, to be very aware of, is not a lot of veterans have benefited from that. In fact, most of us haven't benefited, or certainly not to the scale, the Pareto distribution scale, as somebody like Tim Kennedy or Mike Glover or DJ Shipley or whatever. But then we have to be careful not to conflagrate, not to combine the fact that people worship a person with something that they may actually have done. So if a person is worthy of an achievement, they are due a sense of respect, but for the thing that they've done, not for something that they haven't done. And examples like this with Tim Kennedy lying about his achievements is that it does also damage those downhill. That the concern is that the conflagration wouldn't stop at high profile people like Tim Kennedy or others this has happened to in the past, and it would continue down through turning an entire element of the resentment of gun culture against its own self, against our own people, creating a fault line between different groups that already have their own kind of subgroups within the greater gun culture. Now, there's a element about this which I do want to say is a breath of fresh air, or a sense of soothing balm in an already fresh wound. And that is that this is not the first time that we've seen large cases of stolen valor go public, and with that public element go almost nuclear. But what the result of it has been is oftentimes a season of investigation followed by an easing of that hyper vigilance of sorts. That this isn't the first time that we've seen people of higher profile get not held to accountable, but get addressed, get criticized for claims that are beyond true, that are beyond what actually did happen. And this isn't the first time that somebody with a high profile has made claims about something that they didn't do. And while that oftentimes turns into a season or a wave of scrutiny, it doesn't last permanently. And that this might create a sense of frustration that we can't just have it good enough, long enough to keep going, as in, why do we need to constantly revisit this problem? And that's because, well, this kind of activity, and this is my argument, this kind of activity, this sort of stolen valor activity, is one of those human nature actions that just comes and goes, that it comes, it gets a lot of attention, and it goes away. It comes, it gets a lot of attention, it arrives, it gets smashed down, and then it goes away for some time, but it will never be gone completely, because there will always be some illusion of profit to lying about something that you've done, whether it's in academia, music, sports, games, whatever, right? And so, and in this sense, the gun culture, it would be no different if someone were to claim to be a grandmaster in USPSA, but not be. The thing is, you can look up a record. You can, if you know the right chains, which are not impossible, or even they're not impossible to find. There's a little bit of knowing where to look. But in this case, it'll come and go, in this sense, in a wave. This will come. We need to be careful about the conflagration to limit it so that it's not just scorched earth and creating fault lines between different elements of the gun culture. But moving on. So I mentioned that one of the concerns and one of the issues about vet bashing is that I don't think that it's always coming from a genuine position. I don't think it's always coming from a genuinely moral position. In other words, that somebody might claim to be doing one thing, but they're actually doing something else. And while they may be claiming to hold somebody accountable, what they really could be doing, and this is more of a warning for introspection, is that they may be digging into resentment or ressentiment. While the claim of holding people accountable is often given, and given genuinely, it's not always true. We can hold, and the question really raises, who can we hold accountable? How could I, as an individual who has no personal ties to Tim Kennedy, who has no professional ties through Green Berets, or any relationship with him in any way, shape, or form, hold him accountable? On the one hand, yes, on a scale maybe greater than somebody else, I do have military status or veteran status. I have deployed in combat. I do have some context for these experiences that he might be claiming, or he has claimed about. But I have that which someone, say, who has no military experience and no even adjacent experience could have. In other words, somebody out of the blue claiming that, oh, I'm holding Tim Kennedy accountable, is less, maybe has less, what's the word I'm looking for, proximity than somebody like myself. But even for myself, there's somebody who has closer proximity, which goes back to the theory, which I think those who had the closest proximity, who had the greatest ability to directly hold him accountable, were either unaware, or by the time it came to the limelight, were already well moved on from the situation. Well-timed claims to avoid the responsibility of those who know or who would have been there. So who can we hold accountable? Does it have to be the public writ large? Can the public even do that? And there is also a second problem here, which we've seen in politics, particularly amongst dishonest actors, which is that if dishonest actors accuse you of something, then the last thing you should ever do is apologize. We saw this in a macro scale with the way that racism was used, where people were accused of racism, and the defense, or defending against, well, I'm not a racist itself, was seen as guilt by the dishonest actors. In other words, it wasn't an honest accusation, it was an attempt to disarm, destroy, or defeat somebody preemptively. And finally, on this element of accountability, there's a set of verses in Proverbs in the Old Testament that go like this, and it's Proverbs 24:17 through 18. Do not gloat when your enemy fails. When they stumble, do not let your heart rejoice. 18, or the Lord will see and disapprove and turn his wrath away from them. And this is a warning sign about gloating over other people's downfall. And we've seen plenty of examples, or let's say opportunities of temptation to gloat over the downfall of other people, whether it ranges from Sig Sauer to Tim Kennedy to other people within the gun culture or companies as a whole, where we need to be careful and understand that there is a difference between desiring to hold someone accountable and gloating over their downfall. And this is a worldview identifying perspective about the nature of justice and where it comes from. Is justice something that is only executed by man, or are men responsible for carrying it but not its creator? And as I do a cut to new lighting in the episode, this is where I think that we actually can hold each other accountable. This is where your relationship to your immediate community is where accountability can take place. Where if you see your friend gloating over the downfall of a celebrity they happen to dislike, or, well, we see this a lot in politics, but that's a whole larger can of worms that might just be endemic to the profession, or the way that our system works, or mankind itself. But what we have here, and what I'm addressing about the idea of accountability, is that people can hold each other accountable. We can do that, but we are making a mistake when we are only interested in holding people accountable who are out beyond our reach, instead of addressing those within our own community. And that would be, I want to talk about, I brought it up specifically within this context about the idea of gloating. See, we might look at these very large bombastic events, whether it comes to Sig Sauer or Tim Kennedy, and say, we just want to hold them accountable. And there's a couple ways that you can hold those people accountable. And some of them is the market, and some of them is just disassociation, persona non grata, so on and so forth. And other ones, though, are legitimate grievances and having immediate consequences. But where we can do this, and this is where I cut off on the idea of worldview identifying, is that it addresses where we think justice comes from. If we think it comes from ourselves, then we are really no better than the heathen and the damned. But if we recognize that it comes from something greater than ourselves, then particularly the creator of justice, then we have a means by which to appeal to it. We can appeal for justice, especially in concern of that conflagration, where those who are, say, innocent but caught in the crossfires can appeal to something greater than themselves for that sense of justice. But this also leads to an entirely different element regarding specifically something like stolen valor with Tim Kennedy, and that is what would a road to redemption look like? See, we have a legal system for the redress of grievances, albeit flawed, but what would the appropriate steps be? What would be required of somebody who, say, does commit such actions to try to return in good faith? Where can this happen? How can one prove, or not prove, but how can one in fact receive some form of return to the fold? Is there a circumstance with someone like Tim Kennedy who were to, say, come before the community as a whole and basically confess that, hey, this is all made up, this is wrong, and be willing to accept the consequences? Would he be willing to accept some form of justice? And one of them might be as simple as, well, you're going to be, your reputation is damaged and you don't have any connection anymore to this community. Then, of course, the concern is that he might move on to a different one, namely at this time the political class, to find a new way to get his hooks into the game. But the question I think that I want to extend to all of us is, to all of you, is what would a proper, say, confession or road to redemption look like, instead of just some sort of grueling trudging on for no purpose because there is no redemption at the end? Like, what do you do with that? This is a problem that you deal with not necessarily criminality, immoral action, and that is, if a person is unwilling to, say, change their ways, then we deal with them as something differently than somebody who shows remorse for their actions. And this might be broken up into different groups of people. Like, what is Tim Kennedy's responsibility to the gun culture and to his customers and to the special operations community? Would he be, say, in essence, forgiven if he were to give up his Green Beret, if he were to give up that title and accept it, maybe preemptively, without ego, or having AI write his apologies, or having some PR firm do all the work for him? If he were to come forward and say, I have done this, I have made these claims, I will not redact them, I will correct the record on that. And how could he do that without, how could the gun culture then not harbor or how would that be able to provide the gun culture not to harbor prolonged malice against him? Sure, we might not want to invite him into our halls and give him the floor to speak in all these events. Maybe there's a long road ahead, but it also deals with a certain issue, which is deals with, well, another problem that comes from Proverbs, and that is whoever remains stiff-necked after many rebukes will suddenly be destroyed without remedy. And it looks like, tragically, in some semblance of mourning for the case of Tim Kennedy, that he has remained stiff-necked over many years after many opportunities to course correct, and now the damage is so great that I doubt there's going to be a real opportunity for him to find a home in this community, certainly not amongst veterans, and this is even more so amongst the special operations environment, that every opportunity that every chance he makes inroads will most likely be stifled by the unfortunate nature of, well, what the Antihero podcast has shown about his claims in his book, the Stolen Valor activities, whether it's having to do with Purple Hearts or awards or Bronze Star with V, or just things that he's done. Now, to close this off, and I know that it's not been an easy one, but I want to close it up and wrap this all around back to the end, is that there's been a lot of attention of what Tim Kennedy has done. What has the Stolen Valor been done? A lot of the work and the legwork of that has been done by the Antihero podcast, but I wanted to try to provide a context of how that could have happened, how he could have gotten away with it for so long, changing audiences, strategically making statements long after those who would have immediately held him accountable were aware of what was going on, perhaps a very surreptitious way of delivering information. And then finally, I think one of them is that the way that he made claims were very sort of legalese. Bronze Star for Valor versus Bronze Star with V is something that would go over the heads of someone who might go over the head of someone who isn't aware that a Bronze Star with V is very different than saying Bronze Star for Valor. You're conflating two things. You're making the language deliberately confusing to allow implications to be assumed without accepted, or without being able to say take responsibility for them. I think that's a consistent case there. But that we've also seen that this accountability isn't universal, that there are some forms or examples of holding people, claiming to hold people accountable, that's just gloating over their downfall, gloating over somebody who's been lying in this case about their fame and their power and their abilities. Like, gloating over them is not going to do anyone any good. In fact, I think gloating is not abdication. It's an injuring of justice. It doesn't achieve justice. It mimics it. It makes it not just more personal, but it turns it into something else. Like, vengeance and justice are not the same thing. But we're already, at this time that we're living, we're already wary of clout chasing. And one example that comes from, say, a little bit of insider baseball is that if you go to SHOT Show, or if you've been to SHOT Show over the last, say, 10 years, there are in 2015, it was entourages and celebrities and following soft operators around. And you could walk the floor and you would see somebody with a name who's got in charge of a big company, like, ooh, and he'd have a gaggle of people following behind him. And if you went to SHOT Show this last year, that was distinctly absent. In fact, I think it was the year prior. It could have been this year or last year, where the only place where you really saw entourages were like unusual people like the Liver King. And so the gun culture, especially the part that goes to SHOT Show, has moved away from the celebrity chasing aspect. And if what happens at SHOT Show flows downhill to the greater gun culture, I think this is a movement in the right direction, that we're no longer just about chasing fame and size of our followings and clout and blah, blah, blah. You're always going to find bad actors. Let's not just say everyone's above the board, but we're seeing a shift away from that, whether it's the celebrity chasing or the venerating of the special operations guy. we're also seeing a sign of shifting where military experience is being more and more perceived as context for something and less of an argument from authority. And this is a philosophical piece. It has to do with logic, has to do with reasoning, where if I give my experience about something, I can try to demonstrate on how it is true, but it's not my experience that necessarily makes it true. The theory can be delivered in the form of context, and that context as experience, but the experience itself does not make the theory true, because we're not omniscient. We can't know all the factors that went into anything. And this is a sort of, if you're familiar with the fallacies, the argument, the appeal to authority fallacy is kind of collapsing, where I can say, well, I am a ranger, or I am a ranger veteran, therefore what I say is true. That might work as a rule of thumb, a heuristic, but it's not a truth-making principle. And it takes wisdom and some knowledge and wisdom in context to make sure we parse between those things. For those who have the experience, who have the grounding, that we're seeing more and more that those with military experience who have been in gunfights or been in combat, you should, if you want to look at something, if you want to listen, if you're trying to determine whether or not somebody is engaging in an argument from authority, or if they're building it as context, ask if the story makes it true, as in, oh, well, I was here, therefore it's true, or in this story, in this experience, I got to see how this happened, and this happened, and this is true as demonstrated in the context. It's not, I am a ranger, therefore. It's more like, well, in this deployment on this, I saw these things happen. We did this flank, and that's how it was effective in that case. You see how I hope I am describing this well enough on how there's a difference between military experience, combat experience as an argument for truth or as a form of context. But we're also seeing things like persona non grata dribble down from the super secret special operations world to the community as a whole, where when not long after the first couple episodes by the Antihero Podcast went public, there was a Tim Kennedy struggled with a certain level of sponsorship. In fact, he lost a bunch of his sponsors. He lost a bunch of those. And there's it would be important to understand whether or not that was because of the claims made in the book that were made, whether it was because of the this would be a question for another day, but whether that was because of the truths that came out in the Antihero Podcast that those professional relationships decided to break away, or if their PR firms just simply said he's too dangerous to be around, and that second one is not as noble as the first. But this also leads to a point for any of you out there in the gun culture of the world outside, is that it takes years to build integrity, a consistency of integrity, but only seconds to lose it. A husband who is faithful to his wife for 20 years and then cheats on his wife after 20 years is no longer faithful. A person who builds a reputation for 20 years and that reputation is built on lies may not deal with the consequences till the end, when right before he cashes out, or even after it all comes down and crumbles, turning his victory into ashes. And integrity in this case is not so much something that I intend to throw as a spear at somebody else and say, oh, you're an integrity violation, but address as a problem that really does appeal to the individual, that it is the individual's responsibility, even whether or not he's being held accountable by his peers, it is the individual's responsibility to hold on to integrity. And if they lose it, well, I imagine the downfall will be great. And this is not to confuse the fact that some people have integrity and are accused of otherwise. Again, that might be another topic for another time, but it's usually broken down to specific cases. And this is also a warning, to those out there who are looking at the case of Tim Kennedy and then wanting to apply that to everybody. Be careful. This should be judged on a case-by-case basis. Just because somebody is high profile and has military experience doesn't mean that they're lying about it. Just because someone is low profile and has grandiose claims doesn't mean they're lying about it. But maybe we be careful about how those claims grip us and pull us around, that whether or not it's like, oh, well, he was a thing, therefore he must be cool. That's not working out well for us as a whole. It's not a really, it's not working out in a good way. But finally, the damage has been done. A lot of the damage here has been done. And unfortunately, we are already witnessing a little bit of the conflagration take place, where the damage that has been done by Tim Kennedy and the nature of something like Stolen Valor is that not only does it discredit the individual, but it robs others of their rightful achievements. It robs others of the credit due for their rightful achievements. This can be as simple as you and I go out on a mission, you do something, I claim, but I claim to have done it. I'm robbing you, I'm stealing you of that. I'm saying that I did it. But it also extends to people that I don't have a connection with. If I claim to have done something that I didn't do, and I gain fame from that, and it comes out into the world, then you are robbing your brothers and sisters, and you're robbing your friends and allies and your fellow servicemen, your fellow countrymen, of the honor due to them. And for those who are outside of the military and want a peek to the window in, that the military still bears strong elements of an honor culture, and what you are doing is not just wrong, it's dishonorable, and may God have mercy on your soul. So, as we close, a lot of the work has already been done by the Antihero Podcast. The theory of how this could have happened involves multiple factors, some of them involving people keeping their head down or not having connections or strategic posting. There is an issue about vet bashing, where we are concerned about it becoming a conflagration and tearing down everybody else. But two things can be true at the same time. Tim Kennedy could have lied about his military career, and those who are, say, holding veterans accountable for their claims are really just gloating or full of resentment. It's not really this is not meant to include all people, but I think I've made that clear by now. And attempts to confuse what I've said with saying everyone who's critical of a veteran or veterans is purely based on resentment is a dishonest argument, and I'm kind of done with that. The intent of this is to illustrate on how it could have happened and some of the consequences and how other people will suffer for it. And finally, if we are going to look at this as a community, we're going to want to address the idea of a road to redemption. And I suggest something to the form of confession. A neck held stiff after multiple rebukes will experience sudden destruction without remedy, and that is not what we want for one another, even if they are a royal pain in our ass. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast, addressing a sensitive and dramatic topic of sorts about how someone could commit such grandiose stolen valor for so long. And it's a podcast on the gun culture, the intellectual tools to self-defense and the use of force and violence, and how do we understand morality and ethics and violence and philosophy in a world that really just likes to give you cheap answers like arguments from authority. So if you want to stick along, if you want to support us, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com, or you can go over to Redacted LLC and pick up some of our merch or stickers or shirts and so on and so forth. Or if you want to support the show in another way, go ahead and check below, grab that code, pick up something from Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com, and we will see you later. So as you go forth and as you engage in the world, remember, go forth and conquer.